Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Brew Pub. I'm your host, Michael Camp, and I'm really excited because we have Steven Hause with us. Steven is a producer, filmmaker, English language teacher living in Spain, which is kind of exciting. He's a commentator on theology and Christian Universalism, and most recently, he's the editor of the upcoming book, Christ Saves All, Christian Universalist Perspectives. Steven, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And I'm glad you edited this book. You've got some great voices in this book. A lot of people who have deconstructed evangelicalism have deconstructed the doctrine of hell. And we have discovered many things, including that the evidence is that the doctrine of hell is a myth, that even the history backs that up. The original language of Hebrew and Greek and the Bible backs that up. The history of where this doctrine comes from backs that up. There's all kinds of things, but a lot of people don't realize that there are different perspectives on Christian universalism, and it's a fascinating topic. But there's overall agreement on some of the big things, but there might be some minor variations and maybe not so minor. So we're going to discuss that today and see what kind of voices there are out there. So first of all, just give us a summary of the book. What does the book portray?
Well, first, I thought this would be an interesting place to start since you mentioned it. The doctrine of hell, even Christian Universalists disagree on whether or not we should use that word, right? I actually still use the word hell sometimes, and apparently you don't, and that's totally fine. A lot of people don't. But I still say, sometimes I say, I believe in hell, but it's very different from what you may think it is, right? Because I believe in the Universalist perspective on hell. And it's totally fine if you don't, because of course the word hell isn't in the Bible, right? There's 4 different words that become translated to hell. So I understand why some Universalists just want to say, no, I don't believe in any kind of hell. I believe in something else. And so even that right there, just the use of a word is something that Christian Universalists disagree on sometimes and have different perspectives.
Well, yeah, that's true, I suppose. I guess the way I've always looked at it is, if you're going to call hell temporary, then it's not hell. It's something else. It's purgatory or something else.
Or sure, yeah, and I get that. Some people think of
evangelical that we were told purgatory is wrong. You can't, so it's eternal. It's too late, right? Exactly. But yeah, I understand that because the word hell is so prominent and in the Bible and in Christian terminology that sometimes it's maybe easier for some people to be open about it if you say, well, I still believe in hell, but a different version of it. And then you go and you're open to what that person has to say.
Yeah, that's what I say sometimes. But I understand why some people want to just throw out the word and just say,
yes,
no, we don't have that. But as far as what the book is about, that's not a chapter in the book. I just think that's an interesting thing that people think about sometimes. But the book is 8 different perspectives on Christian Universalism, not always contradicting each other, but just different focuses, different ways of understanding how Christian Universalism works out. And some of them don't even focus on humans. Some of them focus on other things. But they just are different perspectives on Christian Universalism by 8 different authors who have all written or at least heavily researched this topic before. And I think that they're great voices to listen to if you want to learn about the differences that many people have in Christian Universalist thought.
Yeah, it's true. It's fascinating to see the differences. And why don't you start also by giving us some backdrop on your own life and why are you interested in this topic, etc. What's your religious background where you got to this time where you're doing a book like this?
Yeah, so to give a very short summary version of it, I grew up in Bolivia in South America. My parents were evangelical missionaries, and so I grew up with a lot of the stuff you were talking about, of the talk of eternal torment and hell and stuff like that. And as I got older, to be late teens, I started to think that the doctrine of hell as an eternal place of torment forever and ever with no possibility of repentance sounded not at all like the God of love that was being presented alongside this doctrine, right? The God of Jesus who would forgive his enemies from the cross. And so I started to look at other perspectives. I eventually came to annihilationism, held by Clark Pinnock and John Stott. But then eventually I became convinced of Christian Universalism, and I was very happy when I was convinced of it, because I thought, oh, this makes a lot more sense of a lot of things, and I don't have to carry around this knot in my stomach of of some people will be lost forever, which I had been carrying around for a few years, maybe at that
That's a
point.
good way to put it. A knot in your stomach that you carry around. I think that's a good point, because the doctrine of hell, first of all, it can terrify you as a person, and then when you become a Christian, then okay, they teach you to be have assurance of your salvation and everything. But what about your friends and your family and people you meet all the time that
Yeah.
aren't Christians or not the right type of Christian? And what do you do with that? And it is kind of a weight that you carry it around, a knot in your stomach. It's a dreadful philosophy of the afterlife.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's kind of weird too that, for, like you said, you worry about these other people you meet. For some reason, when I was talking to my friend who he had worried about hell, issues surrounding hell for a long time too, and I said, and he had said that he had suffered for a long time thinking that he would go to suffer eternal torment, right? And I said, for some reason, I don't know exactly why, but for some reason, I was never really scared of that for myself. But I was very,
Right.
very worried about it for people in my life, or even just people that weren't particularly important to me, but that I just met on the street or something. And I would go, this is, it can take up a lot of your time to worry about just how many people will go to suffer eternal torment, or in a later case, eternal loss, like eternal annihilation. They'll be lost forever. And it can be just a weight that you really don't have to carry, because it's not actually true.
No, you're spot on. I mean, it's cognitive dissonance, and I'm I'm getting certified as a non-religious spiritual director, and one of the things that we deal with is hell anxiety. It's people who have an anxiety about hell, and if it's not themselves, it's other people that they love or they meet, or they philosophically it just doesn't make sense, and they struggle with it. So that's a real thing. Um, the other thing that would be interesting to know is maybe if you could give us a summary of uh, what is the case that universalism was the majority view, or maybe at least very, very substantial view in the very first centuries of the Jesus movement.
Yeah. Well, that's a more controversial question, because people are more, they disagree on sort of the documentation of it. But it seems there's a good case to be made, and one good book on it is from the late 1800s. I think it's from 1895. It's called Universalism, the Prevailing Doctrine of the Christian Church During Its First 500 Years, or during its first 5 centuries.
Yep.
It's by John Wesley Hansen.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very good book. It's pretty well documented. Some people say that he exaggerates the case, but even if he exaggerates it, there's still substantial quotations in there that show that at least a lot of people in the early church, Origen, Gregor Nyssa, and a number of other, Theodore Mopsuestia, and Isaac the Syrian, a number of early church theologians held to universal salvation. They just might not have used the same word. Like, they didn't use the word universalism, right? The universalism wasn't there. And also, they may have not always expressed it as clearly as we would want them to, because of certain reservations that they had about expressing it to a wide audience at the time, that they thought, oh, we shouldn't, this can be something that we don't need to express it to the lay people, right? That kind of thing. So some theologians held to that, which was a difficulty. But it seems that it was, if not the majority view of the early church, a very significant view.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, I'm familiar with that book. I recommend that book all the time. And I didn't realize that there was a little bit of debate going on until, I don't know, I encountered a few people who said, well, I don't think it's the majority view. Well, what do you think then? Well, it's still a whole lot of people, still very significant.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think the point is that when we are in certain conservative streams of Christianity, you're taught that there was no debate at all. Everyone believed in hell.
Yeah.
That's just the opposite. So that's, when you figure that out, you're going, okay, wait a minute, this is not true. There's actually major streams of Christianity that believed in universalism, even if they didn't call it that, right? Yeah. So that's very interesting. Let's go get into some of the perspectives of the book. I guess there's 8 different authors, and I don't know. Could you? I mean, without saying each name or something, Do you have a list in front of you? What are the different views?
Yeah, sure. Or even if you're all right with me saying each name of each author, that's fine. I can
Yeah,
get
that's
into
fine.
it. But, so just as the quickest way I can to summarize the views, the first chapter is the classical perspective, or the patristic universalism, which is written by Jean Wyatt, and she talks
And
about
patristic means for
patristic
our
in this case of the fathers, of the church fathers, right? So it's
church fathers, right?
the Christian Universalist perspective that was prominent in the early church.
Right.
And the reason we call it classical too in the book is just because it's really the most mainstream kind, if we can call any kind of Christian universalism mainstream today. It's the mainstream kind of Christian universalism that's held to by people like Robin Perry and David Bentley Hart, if people are familiar with those kinds of names.
Right. Right.
But that perspective is that there is some kind of suffering for sins after death, and that there is some kind of quote unquote hell, or though you might call it a purgatory or something like that. There is some kind of suffering, but that people are able to repent after death, and they're able to go through this, suffering or punishment process. Some people wouldn't call it a punishment exactly, but this kind of process that will eventually lead to repentance and restoration with God. So it's sort of the more old school kind of Christian universalism.
Okay.
But then there's another perspective by a guy called Jonathan Buttry, who is a primitive Baptist universalist, and he writes from the ultra universalist perspective. So that means that there's no suffering at all after death. Anybody and everybody will simply be immediately in the presence of God, and they'll be holy and happy, and they won't go through any kind of fire or suffering or any kind of refinement, even metaphorically, right? They will simply be immediately holy and happy with God upon death.
Aren't those folks like, if there's a need of that kind of a suffering, or it's not suffering maybe, but just the consequences of their actions, that they believe that only happens in the here and now, not in the afterlife?
They believe that kind of thing only happens here and now, and so any kind of reference to that in the Bible, they take it to be here and now. So they have a very particular way of reading the Bible. They're also often, if not always, determinists. They're, sort of a Calvinistic understanding of everything that will happen in the world is programmed by God, and so there's nothing that happens that is outside of God's plans in that way, right? It's not the Arminian perspective. So
right. Okay.
this view was very popular in the 1800s, and then it pretty much died out, and there's kind of a small group of primitive Baptist Universalists and a few other people that hold it today. It's interesting, but it's not what most Christian Universalists hold to.
Right. Okay.
And yeah, so then the third chapter is by Steve McVey, who doesn't actually call himself a Universalist, but this is the perspective that everybody is already saved. Everybody's already reconciled to God. Some Christian Universalists will express their view as some people are saved now, and eventually everybody will be saved, right? But McVey expresses his view as everybody is saved now, but just some people don't see it. Some people aren't living in it, and some people don't recognize it.
Right. Okay.
But everybody is saved, and everybody is reconciled.
Right. Okay. Yep. That's very familiar with that.
Okay. Yeah. And then another view that doesn't have to do with humans is by Jesse Hake. It's a chapter on animals and whether or not they'll be included in the restoration of all things, whether they'll be part of the eternity in paradise with us. And he makes a case that they are part of God's eternal plans, and that they do have something that can be compared to souls or spirits of humans, right? And so animals will also be included in that vision. So it's a Christian Universalist perspective, but that chapter doesn't have to do with the what happens to humans in the future, but it has to do with these non-human.
Okay, no, that was very interesting. We're going to talk about each of these in a moment in more depth, but I didn't get a chance to read that chapter, so I'm very curious to see what you have to say. And then what's another? There's a few more.
Yeah, there's a few more. So one is about the devil and demons, and there's a few different perspectives that Universalists could hold to presented in that chapter. And then there's, and that one's by Enrique Ramos. And then there's a chapter on reincarnation. That's by Kalen Freestad, who's a United Methodist pastor. And he gives some reasons why he thinks that reincarnation works very well with Christian Universalism, and why reincarnation is actually the process that God will use to save all people. And then there are two more chapters. One is by Thomas Talbot, who is, in the end, kind of the reason I wrote the book is because of Thomas Talbot. I was so happy that I was able to get him in it. And he has a very unique perspective, which is that God will never stop making people. He will always create new people. And so there will never be a time where all people are saved together, which is what many Christian Universalists hold to, but that God will create new people. They'll need salvation, and they'll come into God's kingdom, and then there will be new people created, and they'll need to be saved, and that will keep going on forever and ever. So everybody who's created will eventually be saved, but there will never be a time where everybody is together.
Okay, so that's called the
state.
ongoing creation. Okay, all right. Well, that's very interesting too, because I'm a Thomas Talbot fan, and I did not realize he had that view.
We can talk about that too, but most people didn't. But I actually read it in a footnote in his book, The Inescapable Love of God. And
I must have missed that footnote, because that's one of my favorite books. Okay.
Well, it's you may not have missed it. You may just not have noticed it, because I asked other people, I said, did you notice that Talbot said this, what this implies? Because he didn't say it explicitly. I said, do you notice what this implies? And people said, I had no idea. And I said, I think it implies this. And I had to ask him, and he ended up writing the chapter. But the last chapter is the one that might be the most controversial as to whether or not it can be called a kind of Christian universalism. It's by Mark Heim, and he thinks that there are varying religious ends that people can attain to. So if, let's say that you are aiming for nirvana, if you go through your religious process, you go through your life, and you can eventually attain nirvana, but that's different from the Christian understanding of paradise. So it may be that everybody reaches a good end, at least from a certain perspective, a good end, but that not everybody is together in the Christian understanding of paradise, where they're individuals personally worshiping Jesus and happy together. He thinks that is not likely, but that there are many different good religious ends that different people can reach. So some people, he's a Christian. We could call him, he's said that his understanding of different religions is a kind of inclusivism. I'm not sure if everybody will know what that word means, but so it's a kind of inclusivism, but it's not a pluralism. But basically, the question that some people may have is whether or not that's a kind of Christian universalism. But I thought it was worth including because it's an interesting view.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm familiar with Mark Heim from his book Saved from Sacrifice, where he goes into the penal substitutionary atonement theory and critiques that, and etc. But I did not know he had that view. So, I mean, the question is, like for some of us, we would love to convince our conservative Christian friends that hell is a myth, or whatever you call it, or your view of the traditional view of hell is a myth, and universalism is true. So how does this help in that endeavor? Does this muddy the waters, or do you think this is going to be helpful for people?
If the goal is to convince a conservative Christian friend to come to universalism, this probably wouldn't be the book. Right. To tell the truth, I wrote this book thinking more for people who already hold to universalism but want to learn more about universalism.
Right.
Because a lot of the books are written kind of making the case for universalism. This book doesn't make the case for universalism. It's not a universalist apologetic. It doesn't really make the arguments of, oh, this verse, you can use this and come to believe in universalism. Not really. It kind of takes it as the assumption and just says, but which view do you hold to within the universalist perspective? But if somebody were to want to read it and see which one they could manage to hold to, maybe if they were conservative evangelical, I believe it'd probably be the classical or patristic view.
Right.
At the very beginning
of thinking that, and I think, I don't know, maybe Steve McVeigh's too. I can't remember which one he was, but
it could be,
already reconciled. Because some of the arguments that I saw in those two chapters, I thought, those are making a good case of why the traditional doctrine of hell doesn't make sense. So there's definitely a philosophical reasoning in some of the chapters that helps people see, okay, logically this doesn't make sense. And even when you look at some of the verses in the New Testament, biblically, it does make sense, or at least universalism does. So okay, why don't we get into the different and kind of more in depth in each one then. Let's, starting with a classical patristic view, maybe a deeper dive into that one so people know what's being dealt with.
Yeah. Well, some of the points that are made in the chapter are the same points that are made in a book like the one I mentioned earlier by John Wesley Hansen, Universalism, the Prevailing Doctrine of the Christian Church. So some of those same points are made in this chapter, but in a more condensed form. It talks about how the Greek words don't have to be translated as eternal punishment. For example, it can be
Right.
translated as a chastisement in the age to come.
Right.
And that's a legitimate translation. I mean, people can argue about whether that's the best translation, but that is a legitimate translation option. And that will change things. If you believe that that is a better translation, that will really change how things are seen. So not eternal punishment, but a chastisement in the age to come. And a lot of the Greek speaking church fathers held to that view. They thought that there was some kind of punishment in the age to come, but that it wasn't everlasting, and that it was actually chastisement in the sense in that it was for correcting the person, not just for causing suffering to the person, right? So in that chapter, it goes into a little more. It has some quotes from early church fathers, some quotes from some other theologians as well that make the case, or at least explain why somebody can hold to that view of Christian universalism.
Yeah, that's important. Yeah, so that's really a critical chapter for people to grasp. I think it's a good foundation for the book. Because like you said, it's kind of like when someone makes the case for universalism, they draw on those kinds of that kind of data that would be in that chapter, right? That historically it was common, if not the majority, that these ex-church fathers embraced it, that others they still embraced it, and we can prove they embraced it, but they didn't make it public because they were afraid that maybe people wouldn't try to live a righteous life or something if they knew this. I'm not sure what their problem was.
Depending on the era, sometimes it might be that they thought that people wouldn't live a righteous life, or sometimes it would be that they would be persecuted because by other people. So it depends on which time in the church history.
Okay, they might be persecuted. I see. Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think the point I would make on that chapter would be that it's related to the character of God. If you think the character of God is retributive, that God has to punish because he's just and he can't stand humanity's sin, and there has to be a payment and a debt and everything to pay, then there's retribution, whether that's you go through punishment or you go to hell, right? And so but the case of when you say the chastisement of the age is what eternal punishment really means, and actually Dr. Ann Nyland, you probably know this too, calls it the reconciliation of the age. It's kind of like God's rehab program, right? It's like, okay, there's some lost people out there who are really doing evil things, and they need to be restored. How do you do it? So this is kind of making the case that, well, there's a rehab program, a chastisement of the age, a corrective period. Probably it can happen in this life, but probably happening in the afterlife too. And that's when someone is restored who has been on a path of evil doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that that's a good comparison too. It's sort of like what Thomas Allen wrote in his book Universalism Asserted, which has also been called Christ Triumphant, although I don't know when that title changed. He had originally called it Universalism Asserted, but he made the case that the prisons, at least the best prisons, should be based on reforming the character of the person.
Exactly.
It shouldn't just be, oh, you stole something from a store, we're just going to make you suffer for that. It should be about saying, hey, we want you to go through this process and actually become a better member of society afterwards. You're probably going to suffer along the way, not because we're whipping you or something, but there's suffering involved in correction, and there's suffering involved in growing and learning a lot of times, but it's not just suffering for the sake of making the person suffer.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not punishment for punishment's sake. Yeah. It's a correction for the benefit of the person who's receiving it, even though it may be a painful process. So just like a drug addict goes into rehab, it's painful, but it's for their benefit, right?
And in the end, it's for the benefit of everybody, which is what
in the benefit of everyone. So that's one of the cases I make in my book, Breaking Bad Faith, putting here in a shameful plug here. It's that God is restorative, not retributive. And so if God always wants to restore people, he doesn't want to punish you for punishment's sake. He wants you all of us, to be redeemed, restored, and to be a person of love and right standing, or being a right person, doing the right thing. So that's very interesting. So that chapter would deal with that and bring out the character of God of being restorative, not retributive.
Mm.
Okay.
And just speaking
Yep.
of the shameful plugs, there's a documentary coming out next year on my YouTube channel, Love Unrelenting. It's called Crux Christi, the Cross of Christ in Latin. And you're actually in it from when I interviewed you in person 2 years ago.
Okay.
And
All right.
you talk about that restorative aspect about it, and how
Right.
Christ was on the cross forgiving people, but he wasn't on the cross suffering the retributive punishment of God, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I love the way you do that, Steven. I mean, every once in a while you go, okay, I finished the video, and like, you're in it. And I'm like, what?
Yeah.
And then I'm looking for myself, and I'm like, oh, there I am. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's very cool. I really appreciate you and I met at a conference in Nashville called Awaken. You were already videoing people for one of your documentaries, and you said, oh, I didn't know you were going to be here. Do you want to get videoed? And you were very, very accommodating to me. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, it was great. I didn't know you were going to be. We had already done an interview over Zoom like a year earlier, and then I just saw you there. I was like, okay, cool. Well, let's set it up, because I prefer to do the interviews in person when possible. They turn out better, I think. But
right, they do turn out better. So okay, all right. So let's move on to the next one, which was very interesting. The ultra view of I guess they're called Universal Baptists.
Or Primitive Baptist Universalists.
Oh, Primitive Baptists. Okay. So this is really interesting. I never knew these people were around.
Yeah.
Who's ever heard of the Baptists who are Universalists, right? So tell us about them.
Yeah. So I had heard about them. There's actually a book about them called Sinners in the Hands of a Happy God. It was written in the 90s.
Oh, okay.
It's by Howard Dorgan. So they are known as an Appalachian group, more or less. And so the reason he wrote about them is because he was an Appalachian scholar, but he wasn't like a religious scholar. But I haven't actually read the book. I've read portions of Dorgan's work before. But so that's the main book that's about them. But I didn't see any documentaries about them. So I ended up going to one of the churches that was a Primitive Baptist Universalist church. And I made a very short, like a 12-minute video about them. And as far as I know, my video on YouTube is the only video about them that interviews actually practicing Primitive Baptist Universalists.
Very cool.
And one of the people in that video, Jonathan Buttrey, who is the pastor of the church in Tennessee, he wrote this chapter. So he gives out the ultra universalist perspective. It's a minority perspective by far within Christian Universalism. I actually think it's a perspective that a lot of people think more Universalists hold to, because they say, oh, if you're a Universalist, you don't hold to any kind of punishment after death. And a lot of Universalists say, no, we do. But actually, in this case, they don't. So in this case, they are what many evangelicals are afraid of, we could say. But it's not that they don't hold to any understanding of hell. It's just that they would hold to hell as being only here and now. They hold to hell being as the here and now suffering on the earth. And so they were actually called no-hellers by a lot of people in the Appalachian region. They're called, you go into the no-heller church, they'll say.
Okay.
But they don't actually call themselves that. They don't say, no, we do hold to a kind of hell. We believe that there is a kind of hell in the here and now. They don't hold to any kind of hell after death.
Right, I see. Okay, so that's very interesting. So the any kind of chastisement or correction or purifying fire that anyone has to go through, according to them, they go through that in the here and now.
Yeah.
And
there was in the Universalist Church in America before it merged or joined to make the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Church, the association, they held to this view a lot in the 1800s. So there was actually division in the Universalist Church of America in the 1800s, where they were called the Ultra Universalists and the Restorationists. So the Restorationists were the patristic Universalists, or the classical Universalists.
Right.
And then there were the Ultra Universalists. One of the main guys was called Hosea Ballou. And
I remember him.
He was a big Ultra Universalist at the time. But after he died, they kind of faded out, and the Restorationist view took over, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. I could see some problematic natures of that view when you look at some of the most evil people in our history, like Adolf Hitler, Pol Pot or something.
That's what people are concerned with. Yeah, a lot of
Right.
times.
So, but it's an interesting view. I think there's some truth to it, because oftentimes we don't realize that people do go through a type of hell in this life, and they do learn from some of their suffering, and they come out the other side, at least much closer to God, or where they should be, or they come out redeemed on this side. So I mean, it happens, and so if some people don't have to go through all that, whatever it is in the afterlife,
Yeah.
why do some people have to go through that and some people don't? Right.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting way to look at it.
Hmm.
And then just make that point though, why is it called primitive?
In this case, so ultra universalism is a perspective that can be held by different denominational groups or whatever. But in this case, the primitive Baptist Universalist, he actually mentions this in the video that I made too. He would say they're primitive in the sense of not that they are fundamentalist necessarily, but that they're primitive in that they are caring about the basics, I guess. But they're not exactly. They have some views that would not line up with fundamentalism. One is a very heavily metaphorical reading of some aspects of the Bible, and also that they see the devil, for example, as almost most primitive Baptist Universalists see the devil as a metaphor, which a lot of, let's say, fundamentalist Baptists would not hold to.
Yeah, right. And then we'll get into that, because one of the chapters has that in there, right? Talking about what about the devil? Yeah. And the devil as a metaphor. We'll get into that later, but I think also they said primitive Baptist just means the original Baptist. It doesn't mean like the literal.
It doesn't mean primitive in the sense of like to like not using technology or something like that.
Yeah, right. It doesn't mean that.
Primitive in kind of the original intentions of the Baptist.
The original intentions,
the basics,
right.
The original basics that the Baptists would have held to.
Right. Okay. Very good. Yeah. All right. So I think Steve McVeigh is the next one. What was his?
Yeah. So his view is that everybody is already reconciled, already saved. They're in a right relationship with God if they could only see it, right? If they would only accept it and recognize it, right? So it's not that they will one day be saved, but it's that they are now. And if you can open your eyes to that, then that could change your life. But it's not that you actually need to become saved. It's that you need to recognize your salvation and live in it, and the truth will set you free, basically.
Now, that's a very attractive one, I think, because we have this mindset when we're in fundamentalism or evangelicalism that we're not, we're depraved people, and we're born that way, and we're not regenerated by the Holy Spirit until we become a Christian or convert to Christ. And everyone who's outside of Christianity is like that and really can't be trusted, right? So there's this kind of a sense that it's a really an us versus them mentality about the world. But this view totally strips that away, because, all of us are the same. You might argue, we're all made in the image of God. And so even fundamentalists might agree with that, although they would think that was marred somehow. But if you're all made in the image of God, then we're all the same. And you could argue that, we're all restored to God. We just have to recognize God the way he or she really is, and recognize how where we are compared to that. And we go, oh, okay. Now that I know that, I can say, I can accept that I'm saved, and I can start living a different life.
And it goes back to some aspects that were held in the early church too, of how all of humanity was included in the death and resurrection of Christ. They were all included in this. And so you're already included in it, is basically what this perspective says. You already have died and resurrected with Christ. Whether or not you admit it is a different thing, but it's already happened. And so he holds to that perspective that a lot of other popular writers hold to today. I would think William Paul Young author of The Shack, would basically agree with that perspective.
Okay.
John Crowder.
Okay.
And maybe I'm pushing it, but I think Richard Rohr might as well, from just some of the things I've read. Although
Right.
I can't say that for sure, but I think that he would say something along those lines too.
And so would Steve McVeigh say he's not a universalist then, or what?
Yeah, he doesn't use that word, but every time I talk to him, I go, "Okay, you're just not using the word, but it sounds like you
I
are
know,
a
that's what I'm saying. I
universalist."
don't understand. I've heard of Paul Young saying he's not a universalist. It's like, wait
Yeah,
a
him
minute.
too. I've interviewed William Paul Young a few times, and
Yeah.
he's always fine with. He knows I'm a universalist and that my YouTube channel is about, in
Right.
large part, universalism.
Right.
He's fine with talking to me, but he doesn't use that word to describe himself. There may be, maybe we could more rightly call them very, very hopeful universalists. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. If you believe that everyone's already saved, then you have to be a universalist in my mind. That just makes sense. But anyway,
unless you just think that some people will resist, that it's possible that some people might be able to resist their already saved state. They just shut their
right,
eyes. The jail cell is open, but they just sit in the
right,
jail cell and they don't.
right,
But
right.
it seems that Steve McVeigh thinks that that's highly unlikely.
Yeah, and I think if you go back to the Rob Bell concept of love wins, eventually love wins out
Yeah.
because love. We as human beings, we're made in the image of God, and love is we're very attracted to love. So if we can strip out some of the things that keep us from love, then love becomes very appealing, and it's almost like, oh, we can't resist.
Yeah. And if
Right.
God is eternally patient, then only loving,
And
loving for.
exactly. It's
Yeah.
just a matter of time. Right.
Yeah.
So okay, that's very interesting. Already reconciled. I think I think that there's so many things I can think of in the New Testament and Jesus' life that really reinforces that. Um, as in Adam, all of us die, as Paul said. In Christ, all of us are made alive, right?
Yeah.
We all admit that when he says all of us die, all of us die. That's everyone. So in Christ, everyone's made alive, right? And or some other verses that basically talk about or let's say Jesus, the way that he treated people, always treating everyone like, okay, I forgive you, okay, I'll heal you, okay, if you're open to me, I'll do it. It's just like it didn't matter if they were a Samaritan or a Roman or the wrong kind of Jewish person or the poor, the marginalized that were thought to be unrighteous because they were poor, etc. He didn't say things like, oh, okay, you're forgiven as long as you accept my future death on the cross or something, right?
Yeah.
Right. He wasn't conditioning it, right? It was like, you're forgiven. Okay. And so it's kind of like God is poised, ready to forgive everyone because they're already saved. It's kind of like that's the default. We just have it. It's somewhere in ourselves that we haven't discovered yet. Just same way you might have something in your house that you don't even know it's there, and you think you don't have it, but you actually have it because you just haven't discovered it yet, or you forgot all about it.
Yeah. And even just on a more general principle, people can say Jesus did so many miracles without, saying, okay, are you following me or whatever? Like he gave the bread and the fish or wine or different things to people without being like, okay, are you a follower? Are you already saved? Are you regenerated?
Exactly. Right.
His general stance was to be blessing people, whether
Right.
or not they were
Right. It
signing
was
the document the right way.
truly an unconditional love demonstrated. Right.
Mm.
There was no conditions put on it, even for enemies. So, how about the next one? Animals. This is very interesting.
Yeah, I thought this would be a good one to include because not that many people, and I understand why. If you're coming from a view that you don't hold to universal salvation, then you do come to believe that universal salvation is the reality for all people. You don't necessarily focus on animals, right? You're going like, this is such a mind-blowing thing that focuses on every human being that's what I'm going to be focusing on. But it's interesting how many universalists also have a perspective that includes animals, or at least what we might call in quotation marks the higher animals, like dogs and cats, not necessarily like earthworms or something like that. But it is interesting how many, so like George MacDonald, who was a Universalist in the 1800s, had also written on this. And David Bentley Hart is an author who has talked a bit about it a bit today. So Jesse Hake, the author of this chapter, he gets a few sources from the early church and even from the Protestant Reformation, like John Wesley, or even after the Reformation a bit, but like John Wesley and people like that, who and Luther and Calvin too, but people who mention the value of animals and the place that animals could have in Christian thought, and if animals are animated by something that's comparable to the human spirit or the human soul. And he makes the case that we can have hope, or we should have hope, that animals will be with us in eternity, and that they are part of God's eternal plan for the universe. Even the animals will be there. Horses and donkeys and dolphins and whales and cats and dogs and all that are part of God's plan.
So what is the case they can't come up with in the Bible or even in history?
What is the case that what?
What is the case they come up? Let's say, what's the evidence for that in the Bible? Or
okay, in the Bible, well, the just general phrases about the restoration of all things could be some, and I might say a few things that he doesn't necessarily say, but some people point to the passages in Revelation, some of them being including animals, and also the fact that Jesus mentions the sparrows, that God cares even for the sparrows, or even in Jonah about how he says, okay, the very last verse of Jonah says, about the city, he's talking about Nineveh. He's like, I spared the city with many people and many cattle as well. There's
that's a good point. I mean, I wonder. You always wondered about that. Every once in a while, it's like it's like the flip side of that is when they went into the Joshua cities and said, kill everyone, including all the cattle and all the animals.
Yeah.
And the other side is, hey, God cares about all these people and all the animals, right?
Yeah.
So if you're not, if you've rejected the retribution character of God, then you reject those passages in like books like Joshua, and because Jesus did too. But then I could see how you'd say, well, okay, well, actually, that makes animals are special in God's eyes as well.
Mm-hmm. And David Bentley Hart has a video that's on my YouTube channel as well, Love Unrelenting, where he talks about the way that we should think that animals are part of the restoration of all things, in part because the restoration of all things includes all things, and animals are a big part of this world here and now.
Okay, interesting. Okay, all right. Yeah. All right, let's move on to, I think I've got it down as Ultimate Redemption by Enrique Ramos.
Or Enrique, well, he's from Puerto Rico, so it's Enrique Ramos, but yeah.
Enrique Ramos. Okay, I don't say it right. Yeah, okay.
That's okay. But yeah, so he wrote this. He had a bit of that concern that you had mentioned earlier too, about something that evangelicals might want to listen to, or he wanted to present a few different perspectives in there. So he actually, while holding to Christian Universalism, he presents three different ways that Christian Universalists might think of the devil and Satan. And one of those ways is completely as a metaphor. So some people might hold to the devil as just a metaphor for evil that exists in the human mind or in the human heart, and that is spread throughout the universe. And if Satan is a metaphor for evil, well, then he's not going to be saved in the end, because how is God going to restore a metaphor for evil? But then there's also a perspective that I think some people have held to, although I wouldn't say a very large portion, which is that all of humanity will be saved, but the devil and demons, they'll be annihilated.
Right. Okay.
So you're a universalist as far as humanity is concerned, but you're not a universalist as far as every rational creature in the universe, because the devil and demons are on a different level, and it's a different situation for them. Basically.
Right. Okay.
And then the third view he presents is the one that he actually holds to, and is also the one that I actually hold to, which is that the devil is an actual being. Demons are real beings, personal beings, and they also will be restored in the end. And even if if we're talking about time in the age to come and whatnot, even if it takes thousands and thousands of years or whatever, but the devil would be the one who would eventually, even if he was the last one, he would eventually come to acknowledge Christ and turn around and have a right relationship.
And the church father Origen believed that.
Mm-hmm.
So it
Yeah.
has some support from some of the church fathers.
Yeah.
Although I'm not sure if there were any others like that, but
It
yeah.
seems Gregory of Nyssa believed that, although he
Okay.
didn't say it exactly explicitly. He said something. He didn't say the word the devil or Satan. He said something that implied that it was the
Mhm.
devil. That when he said, I can't remember the
Right.
exact one, but yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Well, that's
There's some reasons to believe that all rational creatures,
right.
including the devil and demons, would
Right.
eventually, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the verse that would stumble some people would be, when Jesus said that hell or whatever, I guess, did he say the grave or Sheol? I can't remember what term it was, but was created for the devil and the angels, right?
Yeah.
So as if that's where they're going to end up.
Yeah, that could be a verse, and there could also be the verse in Revelation where it says there the smoke of the torment will rise forever and ever,
Right.
and the devil and such. But of course, even there, one, Revelation is kind of a hard thing to take too literally, but also even there, it could be interpreted as ages and ages instead of
Yeah, right.
forever and ever.
Whenever time you see forever and ever, folks, in the New Testament or the Old Testament for that matter, that should be a red flag because as far as I don't know the exact numbers, but 90% of the time, if it's not talking about the real forever. It's talking about the ages or the the age that's coming or whatever the ages that ages. So
The aionios word, yeah, that means ages, is the main word that's used in the New Testament, and aidios, which means it's a more literal forever. It's only used in two different cases. One time is to refer to God, and one time is to refer to eternal chains, I think, or something like that.
Right. So it's right. So the real word for eternal or forever is only used twice, and once is for God, and once is for some vague
chains,
concept.
Chains that don't necessarily mean that you would be in the chains forever, but so some people might say that universalists make too big of a case on that, and I've heard that, but it is interesting that there are two distinct words, and they consistently chose to use the word that didn't have to be read at all as everlasting.
No, that's exactly right, and it's the same truth with the punishment word. They use kalasis instead of Temoria, I think it is, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So kalasis means correction, restoring, somehow making person better, and then the other term, it means actual punishment, right?
Yeah, it's more of the retributive view, and the kolasis apparently had its roots etymologically with pruning trees.
Right. So okay, so that's ultimate redemption for everyone, including the devil, or the view that the devil is and evil spirits are just metaphors.
Yeah.
Okay, so then let's move on to I've met Kalen Fristad, and I was in the Christian Universalist Association on the board for a while, and went to a couple of their conferences. I did not know he had this view.
It's funny. It's funny how when you talk to people, sometimes they'll come out there like Talbot and Kalen Fristad too, where because you can read his book. It's called Destined for Salvation, and he doesn't actually go into that.
Right.
The idea of reincarnation, he doesn't go into it there, but he's believed in reincarnation for many years.
Okay, well that's fine. I mean, I have never taken it seriously, frankly, but I did read part of the chapter, and I did realize that you know what, I could see how you could come to that conclusion, because there are some things in the New Testament, at least, that look like people believed in reincarnation, and maybe even Jesus accepted it because he never corrected it, right?
Yeah.
So what would you say about what are the main points?
Well, reincarnation, definitely most Christian Universalists don't hold to it. I also don't hold to it, but some of the points that are made are that there are some, not only as far as the New Testament not New Testament and Old Testament, that there's some implications in there. For example, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword.
Right.
If you don't take that as a general principle, you might think, okay, but what if this guy did live by the sword and he died of some illness? Well, when will he actually end up dying by the sword. Oh, well, then maybe in his next life he actually ends up dying by the sword. That's when the justice comes full circle, right? Is
Right.
through
Okay.
a different lifetime, those kinds of things. But the biblical passages aren't particularly strong. He doesn't focus on it too much in the chapter either. But a lot of people would also argue from some early church fathers that at least implied that they might hold to universalism. So he does that too. I mean, not just universalism, sorry, a reincarnation as the way that universalism comes about. And there are also things like child prodigies just in the world in general that can have surprising talents at a very young age that it seems like
Right.
they're kind of holdovers from another life.
Right.
It's not exactly convincing to me, but I'm just saying some of the points that
Yeah. I
reincarnation is
understand.
not to.
Yeah.
And also just a general idea of justice to work playing out through the world, that if you were to do certain things in one life, you should come back and live through the full justice that you need, not just in some spiritual purgatory that other universalists might hold to or something like that. But the and he also makes the case about how many people just throughout the history of the world, of any religion, of any country, have held to reincarnation, and it is an awful lot of people, and it is a very widespread view, interestingly spread across all kinds of different countries and cultures. So it is interesting how it's something that unites a lot of humanity, the belief in reincarnation.
Yeah, that's true. And the East, it's very prevalent in Asia. But the thing that was interesting to me was that, and I never really picked up on this, was that he mentions a couple of times, how like he would say, "Who do you say that I am?" or "Who do the people say that I am?" And some people would say, some people said Elijah, and some people said you're Jeremiah. And it was like, oh yeah, that's a common view. Is like you could be someone from the past and you've been reincarnated. I mean, it sounds like that.
Yeah. And it is true that Jesus didn't say, well, no, I'm not Jeremiah because nobody will ever be Jeremiah again.
Right.
He doesn't say that. He just says, no,
right.
I'm not Jeremiah because I'm a different guy.
Right.
But yeah. And so, yeah, he does make that point as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And also John the Baptist, at one point, Jesus said, well, Elijah, that is Elijah. And most people have always taken it that symbolically, right?
Yeah.
Symbolically, John the Baptist was like Elijah, right? Not literally. And so Kaylin is just taking these things literally, and maybe looking at some of the other views all over the world, and just assuming that those are true, and that's his position.
Yeah. And there are other, one of the people he quotes in the chapter is Leslie Weatherhead, who was a Methodist pastor in England.
Yeah.
Maybe less than 100 years ago, but quite a while ago now. He was kind of a contemporary of C.S. Lewis, and he wrote a few books. One of them is Life Begins at Death, and The Christian Agnostic is another one. And he also was a Universalist, and he believed in reincarnation. So there have been a few other examples in history of
interesting
who were Universalists and believe in reincarnation.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so let's go on to Thomas Talbot's ongoing creation. God's always going to be creating new people. This is very interesting.
So for people that are interested in Christian universalism, one of the great books is Thomas Talbot's The Inescapable Love of God. It's probably one of the biggest books on the topic. And when I was reading that book, I was really enjoying it. And I read in a footnote something about how he thought that maybe we, in the future, after we have moved on to the next life, we might be like angels, and we can be working to restore. We can help restore people who would need salvation at that time, and then those people would work to restore other people who are created. And so this process of this ongoing creation, I thought, I don't think many people have realized the implications of this footnote necessarily. So I asked him about it. And I said, does this mean that you think that God's never going to stop making people? And so there will always be new people to save, and these people will come in and be saved, and there'll be new people made after that, and it'll just be ongoing. And he said, yeah, that's, I mean, I'm not convinced of it, is what he said, but he's like, yeah, I think it's a reasonable view to hold, and I kind of hold to it. And I said, okay, well, I want to make this book on varying views of universalism, and it'd be great if you could write your chapter on it. He said, okay. And so I was just so glad that I got him to do it, because there's not many people that hold that view. There are a couple other, and interestingly, they're all philosophers. There's one guy called Josh Rasmussen. Have you ever talked to him?
No, I haven't. Mm-mm.
Okay, so he's a very deep thinking philosopher, and he at least holds the view as a possibility, a reasonable possibility, right? And he's also written a book on universalism with his wife. And then there's also Alvin Plantinga, who I'm not sure if you've heard of, but he wrote a book
Yeah.
called God, Freedom, and Evil, and a number
Yeah.
of other books. And he also, although he never wrote on it explicitly, according to Josh Rasmussen, he also held to this view, at least as a genuine possibility of how it might play out. So God will always be creating new people, and these people will eventually be saved, but then there will be even more people created. And so it's just an ongoing creation. God has this everlasting creativity, and so he will just always be creating new people, and we'll be playing our part in that. And the universe will never stop having adventures play out, basically.
That's very interesting. I did not know he had that view, and I think it's. I think one of the things, you made a good point. He said, "Well, I'm not totally convinced of this, but that's what I believe." And so I think that's a good point to make here, is that, none of these people, in my mind, except for maybe if they have some really hard evidence on, like, the history and what the words hell and Gehenna, and excuse me, what the word you know eternal punishment and hell and Gehenna and all these other terms mean, right? Unless you have these, like, really concrete evidence, right? All these other things are philosophical. You're not 100% sure. You can't be certain about this, but this does make sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a good point to make. There's a difference between, like, the hard facts of history, let's say, and what, biblical narratives mean in the original language and culture, that you can make a really good case for and be relatively certain that this is really true because it's all there right in front of you. And then other things where people are just maybe maybe just surmising from other evidence that's good, but they don't know for sure.
And Talbot too, in this case, part of it is that he's a philosopher. So I think some of the reasons for why he wants to hold to this view are philosophical concerns. And one of them is kind of, what will we do if we are all, holy and happy in eternity? But what will be our sort of ongoing activity?
Right.
Won't it kind of stagnate? But
Yeah, right.
in his view, if there are new people always being created and new adventures always happening, and we are helping out in these cases of people that need some kind of salvation, or they need to be helped along in this process, if we're involved in that, there will always be ongoing new things to learn, new things to do, and new useful endeavors, right? It's not just, what many people imagine heaven to be, if we're just all worshiping in a stained glass windowed covered church, right? And so
Right.
I understand that it's not a concern that particularly worries me. I just kind of think, like, okay, well, we're not going to be bored in heaven because there's going to be all kinds of new things and stuff.
Yeah.
But I kind of get the concern that he's saying, like, we have to be doing this genuinely meaningful activity.
Yeah, I can see that too. Yeah. One way of looking at it is, like, if we had, there's how many billion people have been alive in the
yeah
in all of human history. There's a lot of time to get to know everyone, and that would be an adventure, right? But I could see how you could also look at it this other way too, because, well, what are you going to do? Just hang out and talk, or is there something more interesting that you're going to do to help other people, right? So
but my concern with it, and if I could just mention it, a criticism that a light criticism I think that I gave to him when I interviewed him last time I saw him too, was that so there's a book by Thomas Allen called Universalism Asserted, and one of the points that it makes a lot in that book is that in universalism, God will finally and completely defeat sin, which is, when it's compared to the view of eternal torment, it's kind of a strange view that they hold to. God doesn't annihilate sin from the universe, he just lets it exist.
Yes, that's right. Right. It doesn't defeat it, right?
And I told Talbot, this is a little bit my concern with your view. I told him, I said, in your view, sin is an ongoing presence in the universe. It's, of course, new people are sinning and they need salvation, but there is never a time where sin is gone forever. And I said, so in your view, it's not as if God has eternally defeated sin. It's just that God is the consistent and eternal sin defeater, basically, right? And he basically said, yeah, that's his view.
Yeah, but on the other hand, you could argue that, well, no matter what is created or who is created, eventually sin will be defeated. God's defeating it
In each,
ongoing.
he defeats it in each individual case, always.
Right.
Yeah,
In each
and
individual.
that's why it doesn't worry me that much, as if like
Right.
eternal torment, obviously. But
Right.
I do think it's going to remain a minority view, in part because of that, probably with among universalists.
Right. I mean, a lot of these things, like, these are the mysteries that we have in front of us. And at the end of the day, no one is going to be like, okay, we figured it all out.
Yeah.
It's chapter 10 or whatever, chapter 7 is the one.
And also, these are the kinds of debates. There are kinds of debates where I actually get like upset and stuff, and I've had them maybe like with some people who hold to eternal torment or something. I'll be like, okay, guys, come on, you're saying crazy stuff. But when I'm talking among Christian universalists, these are the kind of debates that are fun for me. This is kind of
Oh, I
why I
know they
made
are
the book.
fun because we're not like you said. I don't agree with him here, and I didn't
Yeah,
agree with several of them, but I
yeah,
actually thought I saw some patterns in more than one. Say, okay, I believe that here, and I believe that here, and I believe that
yeah,
here, and it's
yeah,
just it's fascinating to see it all in different perspectives
yeah.
and different ways of maybe um, looking at some of the mysteries and suggesting some solutions to those mysteries, but we're not fighting about it, right?
Yeah, yeah. And it's sort of like you had mentioned earlier that you were on the board of the Christian Universalist Association, and I am also. I actually have a meeting soon.
Oh,
And
okay.
well, not too soon, but in a few hours, when at the time that we're recording this. But yeah, and that's sort of what it's about too. It's about like we don't have to hold to this specific same view of Christian Universalism, but we're united around these basic
Yeah.
principles of Christ will save all
Yeah,
people
come up with
and
the
God is loving
principles.
to all people.
Right.
And yeah,
Okay.
and so I think it's enjoyable to talk to people about those differences sometimes. Yeah.
All right. Well, there's only one more we haven't talked about. So very quickly, the varying ends view of Mark Heim.
Yeah. So Mark Heim, he's written a book on this as well that's called Salvations. I can't remember the full name, sorry, but it has Salvations in the name. Yeah.
Mhm.
And he has this perspective that there are different genuine good ends that people could come to from their different religious paths, and that it's possible that everybody will come to one of these good ends, but that they are not all the same thing. They're not all the Christian understanding of paradise or heaven, we might say. And so if somebody is aiming for nirvana, they might get nirvana, but that's a less personal, it's an impersonal perspective
Okay,
on
I see. All
eternal
right.
destiny,
Okay. All
right?
right.
And so he actually breaks it down in a way that is Trinitarian. He's a scholar of the Trinity as well. And so he breaks it down in a way that's Trinitarian, actually, that he sees it as the impersonal aspect as being sort of related to the Holy Spirit, and the Christ-centered aspect as being the one that Christians actually hold to, where we'll be personally with Jesus in the end,
Right.
but that they're sort of walled off, separate states that people could be in the end, even if all of them can, at least in a certain way, be described as good ends.
I
So,
see. Okay.
so I can see why people might be weirded out by that. I was kind of weirded out too when I first heard of it. My sister, the reason I heard of him was actually because my sister was taking his class at Yale before, and I said, "Oh, I'd like to talk to this guy," because not many people have that perspective. But I think it's worth reading about and just listening to him, going like, "Okay, he's really thought this through, even if I don't agree with him in the end."
Right. Well, the thing that strikes me is that there's so many times there's people who have, I mean, what you could argue that, your experience in the afterlife will reflect some of your experience on Earth, and that it makes more sense that, okay, a person is comfortable with something over here. Well, that brings them comfort and joy, right? And something totally foreign to them might freak them out, right? So
Yeah,
so whether that means people eventually kind of come to the same thing or in stages, right? We don't know, but maybe this is what he's trying to make. One of the points he's trying to make is that there could be different experiences and ends that are just like being restored or being in heaven, let's say,
yeah,
but they're not really what a Christian might say is heaven, a
yeah.
different type of phenomenon.
And part of the reason he is wanting to do this is because he has a high he has a deep knowledge of other religions, and he also has a high respect for people of other religions.
Right.
But he also doesn't want to say something along the lines of John Hick, which is that they're kind of all the same in the end,
I
which is
see. Right.
maybe I'm painting
Right.
Hick with too broad a brush, but it's not like, hey, they're all kind of the same in the end. Markheim is saying, no, I've looked at these different views, and they're not all the same in the end. But I can see the value in these views, and I can see, I want to say, hey, there's a value here, but it's not the same as my Christian perspective, and I can see why you would want to do that, but it's not as, maybe as deep or as meaningful as the thing that I want you to have if you were to become a Christian. But I'm not saying that it's the complete opposite either. It's not like, oh, you're going to go to eternal torment or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. It's that, hey, you can have your religious end that you're aiming for, but it's different from the Christian end.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. All right. Well, this has been a great conversation, Steven. Thank you so much. Folks, the book is Christ Saves All, Christian Universalist Perspectives. It's going to come out in a few weeks. And in the show notes, we'll put the links into Amazon and other things. Now, Steven, tell us about some other ways of finding the book and more about your documentaries.
Well, as far as I know, the book will be readily available on Amazon. It's only being put out by Choir Publishing, and so that'll be the best way to do it. And it'll be for Kindle, digital copy, and a physical copy, right? You can get that. And as far as the documentaries go, if you're interested in documentaries on Christian Universalism, you can check out Love Unrelenting on YouTube. There was a documentary recently put out by about the author David Bentley Hart, which is a biographical documentary. Lots of fun if you're a fan of his work. And there are other ones that focus on certain theological topics as well. Inerrancy in the Bible. How should we view that? Is that are there other ways of looking at the Bible that make it worthwhile, but not holding to inerrancy necessarily? Or creation and evolution, things like that.
Right. Yeah. You've got a lot of interesting topics on that. So we'll put that in the show notes too. A link to your book, which is out April 15th. A link to Love Unrelenting, the YouTube channel. And you can see all those things. Steven does some really good filming and documentaries that are very informative. So folks, be sure to check that out. Steven, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It was great to talk to you.
Okay, folks, until next time, enjoy responsibly.